Okay, hi everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Kylie Pappalardo. I am a senior lecturer in the law school here at UT, a chief investigator in the Digital Media Research Centre, and an ARC Early Career Research Fellow. I have the pleasure of moderating today's session on search engines and recommender systems. So our purpose today is to consider the social and ethical issues that arise with the use of search engines and recommender systems. And in particular, to look at how can and should platforms take responsibility for how their recommender and ranking systems display, privilege, and amplify certain messages. So we're going to run a similar format to the previous session. We have 4 panelists who will each present for 5 minutes each, and then we will have a Q&A session. So what I will do actually is introduce our 2 panelists from RMIT first, who are joining us on Zoom. You can read all of our panelists' full bios at the back of the program. And if you've lost the program or the code for Slido, it's on the back of your little thing here. And you can see everything they've done at the back there, but I'll just give you a very brief bio for each speaker, and then we can get straight into it. So I'll introduce, as I said, Jeffrey and Mark first, who are joining us online. So Jeffrey Chen is a senior lecturer at RMIT University and an associate investigator with the ADM+S. His research interests lie in machine learning, recommendation, fairness, accountability, and transparency, also known as FACT for short, social network analysis, data-driven optimization and decision-making, and the interdisciplinary research that combines these fields to solve novel applications. Also joining us online is Mark Sanderson, who is a professor of information retrieval at RMIT and the head of the RMIT Information Retrieval Group. He is also a chief investigator with the ADM+S, and his research is in the areas of search engines, recommender systems, user data, and text analytics. So Mark and Jeff are our computer science experts on the panel today. I'm going to hand over to them first to do their talks, to really just give us an introduction into recommender systems and search engines and some of the key issues and challenges that are facing us today. So I'm going to hand over to Jeff first.
Okay, thanks a lot, Carly. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great, thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to take a few minutes of the time to basically just give a high-level introduction about how recommender system works, and then briefly introduce some of the stuff that I've been doing within the center. So I guess, you know, all my interest is in recommender systems, and what the recommender system typically do is take users' interests and intents and then try to suggest, you know, interesting and relevant content to them, as I think a lot of you know. And how it does that is in 2 ways, I guess. So one way is that it tries to personalize the suggestions, right, based on the user's interactions with the platform. So it could be YouTube, could be Amazon, Netflix, whatever your favorite media and use recommender systems, right? And it does this in a number of ways. So via direct signals from ratings. So for example, if you rated a video that you're watching on YouTube, then that's a direct signal about whether you like that or not. And also indirect signals, like for example, how long you've been watching a YouTube video, how long you've been dwelling on, say, a web page on Amazon, what you might have searched or queried in, say, on Amazon, etc. Right? So these are like indirect signals about your interests. And these are taken, so this information about yourself as a user is used as a way to try to understand what's your interest, right? Then these are then combined with I guess, personalized information and profiling of other users in the system. And the way that a typical recommender system would use this would be, for example, if a typical user watches I don't know, action movies, romance, although that's probably not the best example, etc. Right? And if you as a user watch say action movies, right, and then they say, look, a lot of the other users that have similar profile to you seem to also like romance movies, so I'm going to suggest a romance movie to you, right? And of course, this, as you know, as part of the center, does lead to a lot of issues about, the majority do. For example, watch this romance movie, but you yourself don't actually like that, right? And so that will lead to issues about, diversity of content recommended, and also things like, for example, the less popular video creators on YouTube or the music producers on Spotify, and these type of producers or content producers won't necessarily have as much exposure as they should, right? So I guess that leads to my interest, right, in this center is these kind of multi-stakeholder recommender systems where we have users, we have the platform themselves, we have the content producers, and each of them have I guess a different utility they want to maximize, right? And the trade-off between these utilities typically would mean that it will be impossible to optimize all of them simultaneously, right? So we have mathematical and decision-making tools, right? Decision science tools to specify what might be the best way to go about this. But in terms of the actual trade-off, right, that's more to do with societal impacts, more to do with a community kind of information, right? And so that part of work, points to that, it's not just a technical or algorithmic solution, right? But we actually need, collaborations with, social scientists, legal experts, etc., to kind of encode that information into the recommender systems. And the other thing I want to quickly mention is this CARES project considered, and so this CARES project that Mark and I are part of, that we also interested in trying to I guess represents the third parties that aren't typically represented in the system. And so just give an example of a GPS system. You have the users who get routed down different paths. You say Google Maps, who does that, but you also have third parties like the local residents who are not typically captured in the system. And we're very interested in trying to capture that information and incorporate it into the recommender systems of the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm looking forward to unpacking that a bit more in the Q&A, but we might hand over to Mark now to talk a little bit about search engines.
Search engines work. Thanks, Jeffrey, for that fantastic summary. The curious thing about search and recommendation is actually a lot of the technology between them is very similar, but the search engines have a big advantage, which is that you come to them with a query. And you come to them knowing you want something, and you can express that as a query. You would come to a search engine unless you knew how to express the query in the first place. So the search engines get a big advantage, that they get a very clear expression of what somebody wants to try and find out. What do? Basically, they find documents that have those words in. But that's not good enough. That's what library systems from 30 years ago used to do. But if you tried that on Google, you would just be overwhelmed with millions of documents that match your query. So what the search engines like Google and Bing have to do is you have to sort the results. And they have to sort them in a prioritization. So some of the tricks that they use, they look for, do the words that you've typed in appear close to each other? Are they repeated multiple times inside the document? Do they appear in particular parts of the document, like the title? A very good trick that actually Google used was If you've got a page which you're searching on, but you have a page over here that links to this page, they look at the anchor text, they look at that blue text that links to this page, and they use what others say about your page as an important clue. So do the keywords that you've typed in match in that blue anchor text? You know, they also look at things like the links. Is this from an authoritative source? And I don't know, Google will boast that they have maybe 300 features that they put into this sorting algorithm, and they sort the documents and try to get the best ones for you. How do they know that's correct? They get raters, humans, to assess thousands of queries on a pretty regular basis to look at the documents that come back. They have a very large manual explaining to those raters what sort of things they want them to do when they're rating those documents. And then they try to find an algorithm that gets as many of the documents that the raters liked near the top. They do also look at click signals. So they look at the way that users interact with the search systems, but they seem to use a mixture of strategies there. Particularly for things like medical queries, perhaps financial queries, they tend to focus more on using the relevance assessments from the raters that they've hired. If you're searching for, I don't know, a game, Mahjong, then they might just kind of take you to the website that people click on more often. So they use a variety of signals depending on the kinds of searches that people are issuing. They're pretty good at it. The other thing that they're very good at, by the way, you might be asking yourself, if Google is so good, how come my university's website has such a crappy search engine? Or how come email search is so terrible on whichever system I'm using? And it's because the search engines also exploit redundancy. There's vast redundancy on the web. So when you type in your query and you think you're getting all the relevant results, you're not. You're just getting the results that match your words. On your email collection, there's perhaps only one email that answers your question. And so then finding the words that exactly match that email is extremely hard. On the web, you get to exploit all of this redundancy. If you're searching for, I don't know, a company that does taxis to Melbourne Airport, if you miss the websites that talk about a cab to Melbourne Airport, it doesn't matter, right? Because there's enough taxi websites anyway. But in things like enterprises and in things like email search, you don't have that redundancy to exploit. Things that could be made better with these search engines, the thing that interests me a lot is I'm kind of an evaluation nerd, and I find evaluation very interesting. And evaluation is, at present, particularly in the academic world, it's quite reductive. If you do a Google search for the 4 letters NDCG, normalized discounted cumulative gain, you'll see the formula that most academics use to decide whether a search engine is any good. Basically, it looks at the way that the list has been sorted. It compares it to the list that a bunch of experts would ideally find, and it makes a comparison between those sorted lists. And it's basically a way of measuring your happiness, your satisfaction with the search engine, but it's a very simple formula. There's a couple of divisions in it. There's a summation, there's a log just to make you a bit nervous, but it's actually very, very simple. And it's an interesting question as to whether those sort of mathematical formulas really capture the way that people feel. And of course, for us, the question is, how do you do something better? Which is an interesting challenge, because you've got to deal with that scale, right? I mean, people like Google, I told you a minute ago, they test thousands of queries. So you want to be able to assess very, very large amounts of content against different iterations of a machine learned algorithm. But you also want to try and capture something more than these very simplified formulas look at. And that's something that we spend time thinking about at RMIT. So hopefully that gives you a quick summary of what search engines are like.
So our next 2 speakers here on the podium with me are from the humanities. And so we'll be telling us about 2 projects, so one that they are each involved in, that look at recommender systems or search engines within a particular area of the humanities. So Louisa Bartolo, sitting next to me, is a PhD candidate within the Digital Media Research Centre. Her research centres on questions around platform governance, with a particular focus on digital platforms recommender systems. And Louisa will tell us a little bit more about that in a second. And our last speaker, Professor Patrick Wickstrom, you've met already. He is the director of the Digital Media Research Centre, a professor of media and communication, and a computational social scientist. His research focuses on developing data science tools and methods to analyse the production and consumption of digital cultural products, particularly music. So I'll hand over to Louisa to start.
Thank you. So yes, as Kylie said, I'll talk a bit about the projects I'm working on in my PhD, and they link really nicely to some of the things Jeff and Mark said. So I'm working on algorithmic recommender systems as part of platform governance. So historically, there's been a tendency to think about content moderation in terms of content removal. And there are plenty of very important debates ongoing about what is legitimate content removal and what isn't. But there's been a more recent shift, which my research is part of, to think about the way that content gets curated beyond purely when it gets removed. So the way it gets recommended to us, the way it gets amplified, the way our attention is shifted through these what have been referred to as digital nudges. So within that space, I'm looking at two specific platforms. I'm looking at book recommendation on Amazon and streamer recommendation on Twitch. And I'll explain a little bit why I think those two are interesting and how they link into some of the points made previously. So on Amazon, I'm very interested in the way books around contentious historical issues are recommended to us. It might surprise you to know, for instance, that when you go to the Women's Studies History category, the #1 bestseller for a long time now, in the months I've been doing my work, is Ben Shapiro, the notorious right-wing anti-feminist commentator. And the second bestseller is his sequel to the same book, which, by the way, facts don't care about your feelings, and facts still don't care about your feelings. When you click on those books, you are suggested further books by Ben Shapiro and similarly problematic anti-feminist writers. This matters because it's not just a problem that's limited to Amazon. I was fortunate enough to be part of a collaborative project earlier on in the year where we looked at YouTube recommendations. And my colleagues and I, and two of them are here, so I'll give them a shout out, Ariadna and Jean. We were looking at what sorts of recommendations Amazon serves up in its Up Next feature when we searched for feminism. And it was interesting. So it was a mixed bag, but a number of anti-feminist commentators did very well. This was interesting because we were also looking at what YouTube was serving up when you searched for coronavirus. And there you had repeatedly authoritative media sources. We know that at this time, YouTube had very publicly made a decision to promote what it calls authoritative sources in its recommender systems. This is part of it. It had a 4 R's of responsibility policy, and one of them was to boost authoritative content. But platforms like YouTube, like Amazon, have historically been quite reluctant to enter into these fraught sociocultural spaces like feminism. And so what I'm trying to look at in my project is what would responsible recommendation look like around those sorts of fraught questions. My second case study is looking at streamers on Twitch. You might think that's an odd choice. But Twitch is very interesting because it forms part of, again, what we know has been quite a toxic, sort of misogynistic gaming culture. And Twitch has recently made several improvements to its recommender systems as it defines them to make them fairer. The way Twitch seems to be defining fairer is to allow smaller streamers more visibility on its homepage recommendations. But simultaneously, it's also introduced a new series of identity tags that streamers can attach to their content. So I can now, for instance, if I were a gamer, go on Twitch and tag my content as female. And that was done to make people more discoverable by their identity group. And it was done on the request of streamers themselves. These are totally voluntary tags, and you don't need to use them. But what this is going to allow me to do with my great supervisors is to look at how fair and how diverse Twitch's homepage recommendations are, with diversity being understood as an identity question, a sort of social diversity. And if I have 1 second left, do I? Yes. I want to link it to some of the points, really important points Jeff and Mark made. So Jeff's point about these are multi-stakeholder systems and you have several also third parties that are impacted. That's a really important point, and it's this argument, Silvia Milano has called it the social externalities of recommender systems that I as an end user, I know we don't like using that term, user, Axel, should be satisfied by the search results I receive or the recommendations, but there is also a broader social cost that we carry when our systems promote content that reduce the value we hold women in or make our gaming spaces less diverse and keep them very, homogeneous. And the next point that I found interesting was around evaluation that Mark ended on, and how do we evaluate these systems when also the tools we have, the ways we've traditionally thought about these things like diversity, have sometimes been quite narrowly technically conceived, but we know there are broader social questions at stake. So I'll leave it there.
So the project that I will be talking about is called Creativity, Diversity and Equity, and it's about music streaming platforms. And you know that every day 60,000 new songs are being uploaded to the Spotify platform. There are at the moment about 70 million songs available for Spotify users to just start listening to straight away. And it's quite easy to show that such access to the catalog easily creates a situation where a small number of well-established artists maintain global success at the expense of less fortunate, less well-established artists that are unable to cut through the noise. So regardless if that is true or not, it has led to intense criticism from various parts of the music industrial establishment, from creators and what have you. And if you look at the numbers, there are about 8 million artists on Spotify. And Spotify themselves report that less than 1% of these 8 million artists generate 90% of their revenues. So it's very top-heavy. And this may sound like a problematic number, but Spotify is very proud of the fact that it is 57,000 artists that are generating the 90%. And the reason why they're proud is that 6 years ago, the number was just, 25% of that. It's 4 times higher now. So they look at this as a huge success. And they use these kinds of trends to counter the criticism from music creators. And they claim the reason for the trend is the successful design and implementation of their music recommender systems. So how are these music recommender systems implemented on the platform? Well, they are playlists. They are lists of songs. And some of the playlists, as I'm sure most of you are aware of, are curated by humans, and they are focused on a particular theme, a genre, perhaps a place, a mood, something like that. And some of them are automatically curated based on the user's listening history and the kind of principles that Jeffrey and Mark Jeffrey were talking about. So the user's listening history, their demographics and location, their social network, and a range of metadata associated to the songs. And playlists have become hugely popular. More than 50% of all streams on platforms, if we generalize like that, are started from playlists these days. So it's very influential on the music that is being played on these platforms. And when the platform operators claim that their recommender systems make music experience more diverse, what do they actually mean? They generally mean that music listeners are enjoying music from a greater number of artists than they did in the pre-streaming era. That's what they claim. And put in another way, you can, if you want, say that the user's musical tastes have become increasingly omnivores. not taking this into the music sociology space, but it's that this is the tension between the platform's claims and the creator's criticism is the starting point for the project that we're working on. And the core question is quite straightforward. How are music streaming platforms shaping music diversity? And the issue of diversity of popular music has a long, long history in academia. Right? It's since the 60s there were studies focused on diversity as the number of artists that became popular, the number of songs that became popular. We've had studies over the years focused on geographic aspects of diversity or genre-based aspects of diversity. I've done a bit of work focused on what music actually sounds like to understand if the acoustic properties of music is changing over time. And the conclusion of all these studies have been that over the past decades, music listeners listen to songs from a greater number of artists, from a greater number of countries, but the songs sound increasingly similar, which is interesting and important for sure, but there are some significant limitations with these studies. And one is that most of them are on aggregate level, they're on industry level. So that means, for instance, that they cannot say anything about different types of music users. They cannot say anything about the avid music listener versus the casual music listener, which probably are quite different in terms of how they experience the platform. And the second thing is that they only use data from popular artists. The 1% that we talked about, if they're lucky, the 1%, probably less than that even. And the reason for these limitations is primarily restricted access to data. And before the streaming era, the data wasn't available, it wasn't possible for very obvious reasons. But these days, the data is indeed available, but it is locked behind the closed doors of the commercial streaming platforms. So this is one of the aspects that I find really exciting about the project that I'm working on, because we've been working very hard. It took actually 4 years to establish a relationship with one of the streaming platforms, which means that we now do have access to their crown jewels. And so it's music streaming data for 3 years, about 150,000 users, and something like 3.5 billion streams to analyze these kinds of things with. So it's a massive data set, and which means that we can go where few researchers have gone before. So one of the things that I am particularly excited with over time right now is questions such as, do users rely heavily on users who problem with the microphone, have I? Yep. Do users who rely heavily on algorithmically curated playlists for their music listener experience develop more or less omnivore's musical tastes than other users over time? So this is a question that very few studies have been able to address previously. So I'm really looking forward to work on that. This is early stages in the project, and I'm really keen to collaborate with as many as possible on this. So if you're interested, curious, just let me know, and I'm sure we'll work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. So we now have about half an hour for Q&A. As before, if you have any questions, if you're in the room or online, please ask them through Slido. The event number is 101 if you're not in there already, and I will ask them to the panel. I can see them here on the screen. So while I give you a few minutes to do that, and I've seen a couple come through already, which is wonderful, thank you. I do have a couple of questions that I've prepared for the panel that I might just kick off with. So the first one I think relates quite a bit to what some of what you were saying, Louisa, which is around a concern that we sometimes see that recommendation systems can radicalize people by taking them down rabbit holes of increasingly extremist content in response to their interests. And if I were to make that relevant to music, Patrick, in a way, I think I'm starting to lead towards that last question you're asking, right? Which is, if people are relying on the algorithm, are they increasingly seeing more and more of the same thing? And if that is the case, how should we think about the responsibility of recommender systems to promote a diversity of viewpoints? I think most of the panelists today mentioned diversity at some point or another, but I have a feeling it means different things to different people. So I'm also interested in what diversity means to you and how you think recommender systems should be incorporating diversity. So that is open to any of the panelists. Louisa, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's interesting in the way you link this question of, which is an understandable link about rabbit holes and diversity. So it's a very interesting paper by Natalie Hellberger, who does a lot of work on recommender systems in the context of news recommendation. And one of the things she's argued is we need to talk about diversity with a mission. So this idea that diversity in and of itself is a sort of intrinsic good that we're all working towards is slightly odd. So you could imagine in a situation where there is a mix of pro-vax and anti-vax content, you probably are not going to be striving for a 50-50 viewpoint presentation there. And really, when we talk about rabbit holes, on the whole, our concern is around things like extremism and being pushed into problematic filter bubbles and polarization. So it's often layered with additional kind of value judgments and concerns we have. And so I think my point would be, in terms of how I think about diversity, I think there has to be another set of questions that come along with diversity. That's what is your ultimate goal? And I think in the context, say, of news recommender systems, Natalie Hellberger's work is looking at kind of what sort of democracy do we want to live in. I think in the non-news space, which is where I'm working, we have questions around social justice, inclusion, representation. So that's how I would.
Great, thank you. Mark or Jeff, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of diversity, right, from the perspective of I guess the algorithmic side, usually that would mean serving up content that's different from what the user might typically see, and I think Louisa's point there is very pertinent in that diversity for the sake of diversity. It can be meaningless, right? Because particularly in the context of, say, terrorism or things that the society may not necessarily approve of, having diversity there wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? And in terms of the algorithmic side, it's actually, we can look at the previous history of people, and also, what Patrick was talking about in terms of the less popular producers, music producers. That could be also a case where we can think about serving up diversity, right? So diversity as in we want to serve up producers that are typically not recommended. But there is I guess, a flip side to this, in that for particularly for commercial platforms, they're there to make money, right? I was getting us to look at the videos so they could serve us more ads, etc. And if they serve up a lot of content that maybe the users might not find totally relevant, then the users might drop off, and so they also will try to optimize for that, and that sometimes will be in conflict with what might be social norms, right? So social norms, and so I guess there might in order to get in order to incorporate this wider diversity of views, either the business model had to be looked at, or regulations, right? Where we say, look, like in traditional media, you can't just show anything you like, but there's kind of regulations and social norms that you should respect.
I think in terms of search, I think what you're seeing is the search engines changing over time. And I remember many years ago, you used to, if you typed in the phrase miserable failure, the White House website became #1. And I remember actually, I got a brief chance to talk to the guy in charge of the algorithm at the time, and I said, is that really the right thing to be doing? I know it's George W. Bush in charge, but really? And he said, well, it's what the internet wants. And he really thought that was the right way to go. And you wouldn't hear that from a search engine today. You would hear a very different view. Now, are they in the right place? Are they in a place where we would all ideally like them? Not necessarily, but there's definitely been a journey over time. And I don't think the search engines are finished. In terms of diversity, there's lots of topics there because, there's kind of like diversity of novelty. So do you bring in an established page that's getting lots of clicks? Do you bring in something new, which is a bit like the music example we were seeing earlier? My favorite acronym, ACL, anterior cruciate ligament, American Christian Librarians. There's an ACL place down here in Melbourne that's actually a car fixing place. So you've got to diversify on those different kinds of things as well as the things that you're talking about, these kind of things like political diversity.
So if I just jump on that point quickly, Mark, in terms of representation on search engines. So Sophia Noble, for example, talks about the images of white men that are returned when people search for executive, or the white-collar jobs that are primarily recommended to white people. And the challenge is that this might accurately reflect society, right? Because we live in a biased and unfair society. And it also reflects, therefore, the material that some of these models were trained on. So I was wondering what opportunities you see in the future to correct for these type of established biases, or what are the challenges there with search engines in particular?
I think the wonderful work that you guys do, finding things that are wrong with the search engines and thinking in ways that I don't think actually makes a huge difference. There've been countless examples, I think, of investigations either by journalists or by social scientists that have thrown up problems that the companies have then worked to fix. I mean, look, actually, I'm setting up a Slack channel for our exec and was struck by how hard it was to find a nice icon that was gender neutral when you type in the phrase exec. So I know exactly what you mean. In terms of jobs, I was speaking to someone from a job search engine who actually was saying to me that he was one of his big fears is his boss standing up at a shareholder meeting and somebody coming up with an example like you described. And so there's certainly, this particular one, I won't name them, but there was certainly something that was concerning them greatly, was to try and avoid those kinds of PR disasters. So I think there's a growing pressure on these organizations to fix them. But you're absolutely right. You type in exec and ask Google to give you icon-like images. It's kind of depressing what you get back.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming in on the app, which is great. Quite a few for Patrick, actually. So I'm going to start with one from Simon Elvery for Patrick. Does your research on Spotify and diversity extend to the payment models that they use? They are automated and algorithmic, after all.
Yes. Well, yes, but I'm not sure if it's in the way that you think of. What we are doing in terms of the payment models is that we are looking at alternative payment models that might solve some of the problems with the current payment models on streaming platforms, where where revenues end up in with the most successful artists and not as much as they might should have with the less fortunate ones again. And we're looking at models where a song that is played from a playlist is generating less revenues than a song that is found via search. And the general thinking behind that is that the one is casual listening and it's not as important in some way than the other one that is found via search, and where someone actually knows that they want to listen to a particular Beyoncé song, and that should be probably paid, while some song that has just been casually played for that user shouldn't get that much funding. But these are alternative models that we speculatively look at what would happen if we do this, who would benefit, who would not. So that's how we're using the recommender systems and connect it with the payment models.
Great. I have another question about Spotify, although I think the implications extend more broadly, actually, from Mark Andreevich. He says, I think it may have been Spotify a while back that claimed to be able to infer political preferences of users. To what extent does an examination of the cultural side of recommender systems connect with questions about political polarization? I guess Patrick or Louisa, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I remember that that claim or report from Spotify, which is interesting if we put it like that. It is simply not part of this study. We are staying with the musical practices and looking at how musical practices change over time, and we're not. We're trying to stay away from those inferences between musical taste and other, or musical practices, I should say, and other opinions or political positions or whatever it might be that you might be able to infer from that. Although, yeah, I've seen that research and it's quite common to do that, right? But it's not part of what we're doing. That's not our ambition at all.
I think I can't speak to the Spotify study, but in the case of Amazon book recommendations, I know, for instance, with one of our search terms is critical race theory, and we know that that is heavily politicized as an issue. Feminism is also bound up with culture wars. So I think when you go into these cultural spaces that are supposed to be non-political, they very quickly become political, and we can think of politics with a small p, you know. So I think we. And I mean, my background is political science, so maybe it's just the way I am, but I think we have to grapple with these questions. So I know it's fraught territory, but yeah.
A question I think probably mostly for Jeff and Mark from Tim Graham. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what authority users perceive in recommender system apps. So for recommended content, do you think that users see that as a source of authority, or really just as a loose suggestion?
So maybe I can kick off. So I guess probably it depends on the thing we're recommending. So I guess for like going back to the Spotify example, that maybe, you know, or YouTube, right? That, you know, the recommendation there may because it's not so much what's called a it's more like a casual kind of entertainment kind of thing, and so in that situation, the user may not see that it's so significant whether the system gets it right or wrong, and so in that case, it's just thinking, okay, it just recommended this, and I like it. Okay, I'll watch it. I don't like it, then let's go to the next one. But maybe for other things, perhaps for news recommendation, etc., then the user themselves may have a little bit more trust, particularly if they it comes from, I guess, a reputable source, or that they in the past have experience with it, that they think, okay, this source of media, this source of recommendation seems to align with my preferences, whatever those preferences is. But of course, it could we could be enhancing the echo chambers, but they still think it's a more authoritative source because it kind of aligns with what they've been thinking about, or what their interests or beliefs are.
I think the search engines have become more aware of the importance of them as an authority, as a place where you get authoritative information. And for me, one of the big changes was about 5 years ago when I was at a workshop, and a guy from Google came to talk about the changes they were making to medical searches, and how they were basically giving up on the algorithms and going to authoritative sources to help them. And they were basically identifying particular sources that they trusted. They started creating these summary pages that dealt with, symptoms from particular illnesses, because they just couldn't, it was just too important, they decided, to worry about, to try and sort of make it, allow the sort of the algorithms to just make the selections. And you see that expanded. They have this very sort of strange phrase. They talk about your money or your life pages, which is basically pages that are either to do with your finances or pages to do with your health. And they've placed increasing emphasis on the accuracy and the quality of those things. So really interesting questions. Like they actually said to some of their assessors, would you trust your credit card with this site? Would you give this treatment to your child? And they sort of try to really push people to try, their assessors to really try and come up with a good assessment. So that works in some areas of search, but then there are plenty of other areas, as we've already discussed, where you use the algorithms, and then, as was pointed out earlier, web pages are written to be found, and people understand that there's a competition of ideas. So people will try to get pages to make sure that they appear high for particular keywords, even if those are contentious keywords. So it's always going to be, there's always going to be that sort of tussle between people trying to get content ranked as high as possible and the algorithms and Google's methods to try and sort of put out something that's a more sort of inputable and authoritative set of content.
I have a question for Patrick from Charles Pigeon. Is it intentional to use the word omnivorous to describe music listening? Are you using it as a metaphor of media and consumption?
I'm using it because to get around the issue of using diversity, as we previously discussed, diversity is challenging when we talk about media diversity or cultural diversity, and it has all kinds of different dimensions and issues with it. Using the omnivore or brings another set of problems for sure. But on the other hand, it takes you straight to music or to culture, and you can talk about more or less omnivorous tastes and practices in a way that is more less complex, perhaps, than the diversity issues. I've had a number of times have to spend quite a lot of effort on defining diversity and with the more or less success. So this is an attempt to make that situation a bit easier.
Great. I've got 2 questions about transparency that I might ask together and throw to the whole panel. So one is from Dan Angus. Platforms often cite the potential for their algorithms to be gamed in response to calls for greater transparency. What is your take here? And the other question comes from Brooke Coco. To the issue of transparency, to what extent are these recommendation algorithms interpretable, or are they black boxes, and what are the implications? So I'll throw that to the panel. Mark, do you want to jump in?
I think the algorithms, so, if you go talk to the people who run the algorithms, they will certainly give you broad overviews. And when I mentioned there are 300 features, they might even break those features down into groups and say, well, these ones really matter a lot, these ones less so, and so on. So you can get a sense of what they're like. And maybe there's an old professor I knew who was involved in a patent case with a search engine. And he told me that he managed to actually see the code. It was part of the patent case as an expert witness. And he said, you'd be surprised how straightforward it is, actually, for one of the very famous search engines. He said, there's no magic in there. It's basically what we do, but just mixed up in a slightly different way. So I think the academics in general have a pretty good idea of how the search engines work. The exact weights and the exact balance of things will be what the companies know about. But I think if you go talk to to computer geeks like Jeffrey and I, you'll probably get a pretty decent idea of how the algorithms actually work.
To Dan's question, do you think that the algorithms can be gamed?
Yeah, and certainly I had a summer with Microsoft about 15 years ago, and that was a huge concern of theirs. They were struggling to stay on top of the spammers at that point, and they were saying, look, I know we're logging everybody, I know we're keeping track of everybody, every click they've ever done. They said we need that information to deal with the spammers. There are people clicking on our ads to try and force us to give them money. There are all sorts of things going on. So certainly spam and people gaming the algorithms is something that you can't ignore. They do need data and a level of secrecy to try and stay on top of that.
Jeff, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I think Mark covered it pretty well, but just to add a bit more about the algorithmic side, the technology there, I think a lot of the tech companies more or less use the same type of algorithms and etc. And as Mark said, the actual implementation is more of a tinkering of the general ideas. So general ideas about recommendation, trying to model how users behave, etc. So in terms of the I guess the how the companies approach it, etc. Probably more or less, it's kind of known how it's done, right? But as Mark said, the going to Dan's question about whether people can game the system, absolutely, right? If for example you do know how the different weights, exactly how they engineer certain things, what things to emphasize, what things that don't emphasize. If that is known, right, then it makes it much easier to game the system, particularly given that there's a general knowledge about how these things work. If the actual formulas and equations and algorithms are known, then you can say, look, if I do this, then I know that it will, for example, increase the weights to this thing, and then that might lead to a recommendation for my for my set of items, right? And so it is definitely gameable, right? If the algorithms and formulas are known.
I suspect as researchers outside of computer science, you both have opinions about whether these algorithms are black boxes or not.
Well, yes, I think it makes sense to consider them as black boxes, but we probably all know the amount of algorithmic gossip or folklore or whatever you want to call it that is an important part of creator culture on YouTube or TikTok or whatever it might be, where creators work very hard to game the recommender systems and where that feedback loop between user behavior and recommender system is an extremely important part of the the culture and practices on that platform. Thinking particularly about TikTok, which is fascinating in the way that the recommender system is front and center. It's extremely opaque, and I think as an interesting example of the value of the recommender system for TikTok is, if you remember when Trump wanted to shut down TikTok in the US, ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, were fine basically of selling the TikTok platform in the US. That was not the problem, but they were very clear about the fact that they would not include the recommender system that was the core of their entire business, which goes on beyond TikTok. And so, yeah.
So I think I've been very inspired by the work of Tana Buhe, and I hope I didn't just demolish the pronunciation of her name. But she has, she's argued that rather than kind of thinking about what algorithms are, we could shift to thinking about what they do. This is particularly for, say, humanities scholars like myself. And what we're really interested when we ask, many of us, sort of in the public, when we ask what algorithms are, how they work, we're interested in their outputs, what they're doing around us. So I approach this question of transparency in my research in terms of what can we observe in patterns over time. So rather than trying to understand exactly how algorithms on Twitch work, or Amazon's recommender system works, I'm interested in what sort of outputs they give us. And I should also refer to the work here of Bernard Rieder and Jeanette Hoffman, who have pushed this idea of platform observation. So I think regardless of whether they are, I'm sure they are interpretable to computer scientists of course. I think when we're thinking about transparency to the public or accountability to the public, we have to think about a different, perhaps, set of questions of how we understand and make sense of these systems.
So we have 2 minutes before afternoon tea. There are 3 more questions on the app. I'm going to just ask one more, and the other 2, I think there might be opportunity for the panelists to answer afterwards on the app. So last question is probably, I think, to Jeff and Mark, from Ashwin Nagappa. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how the physical devices that people use or the platforms like Android, iOS, etc., the role that they play with respect to search engines and recommendations. Does the device impact either the recommender system used or how people experience that?
Probably. I mean, actually, it's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I've got an Android app and I'm probably logged in on my Google account. So maybe there's some cross-application information being used there that's maybe altering my Google search. But I have to say, my kids have got iPhones. I've never come across a search that somehow works for me, excuse me, but doesn't work for them. So not immediately, maybe some location stuff. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, in general, iOS is a bit more privacy focused than, say, Android is. So maybe there's some impact there.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I have both. I have devices that uses both operating systems, and the interface is different. Similarities but have difference, and but in terms of the type of recommendations, I'm not sure if there's a difference on the different operating systems, particularly when some of the apps also recommend the same thing. So like Google Maps versus the Mac OS map recommendations, right? So the functionality there is more or less the same, but in terms of how they recommend, I'm not sure there's a difference.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so apologies to Julian and James Meese. Your questions came in last, and there's no hierarchy here except first in, first served. So thank you to all our panelists for an excellent panel, really interesting discussion on search engines and recommender systems. So please join me in thanking the panel again.